The topic of this particular webinar, like I said, is the CLI. Now, um, there's a whole bunch of potential meanings for the word CLI, and it's one of those things that we often have to explain to people. And this is off to a good start if I'm able to crash PowerPoint. Um, Thank you, Microsoft, for that one. So there's a whole bunch of different meanings that CLI could stand for, including, and I have to admit that I hadn't thought of that, but including the number 151 if you interpret this in Roman numerals. But of course, what we're talking about here is command line interface. There are essentially four different versions of pdfToolbox from callas that you can use. And if you go to the website, you will find all four of them. Those are desktop, server, CLI, and SDK. And the desktop, of course, is the manual version, the operator version. Server works with hot folders. CLI stands for command line version, and that is a version that is available on all platforms and that can automate almost, it's 99% of what is possible in pdfToolbox desktop. It can automate those things, and it is easy to integrate into um, websites like a submission portal or a remote proofing portal or a web to print shop, all of those things. It can even be used and is actually used by people to integrate it into other applications. And the reason the CLI is very popular when we look at who is using it is that on the one hand, it is very flexible. On the other hand, it is, um, well, extremely easy to use and quick to implement if you want. And it does a lot of error handling already for you. So from an integration point of view, it's a really easy way to integrate all of the potential power you have in pdfToolbox. So I have a good tradition of keeping these presentations relatively short when we're talking about the support webinar. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to the command line itself. And well, to do so, what I need is let me clear this a little bit. What I need is a terminal application, and I could either use just the built-in terminal on Mac, but I have something else that is called iTerm2. And on Windows, you use a command prompt or the PowerShell or whatever your favorite terminal application is. Same on Linux, of course. And in this terminal, I can now use the command line version. And you can download that from the callas website. What I have done here is I have actually downloaded callas pdfToolbox server. And the reason I typically download server to do something with the command line version is that when you download server and you install it, you will get both the desktop version and a folder containing the command line version. Yeah. Um, you can only do this on Windows and on Mac. The command line version is not available on Linux or Solaris. Or the server version is not available. The command line version is available, of course. But the desktop application that is part of the server does not exist on Linux or Solaris or AIX. So on those platforms, you have to download the separate pdfToolbox command line application. And when you install that, installing in this case, meaning extracting the archive, what you'll get is basically the same folder. The amount of files that you see in here will differ a little bit depending on the platform that you're running on, but there should be an executable that is called pdfToolbox in all cases. And when I run that executable, it tells me I don't know what I'm doing. And luckily, it doesn't just tell me that I don't know what I'm doing. What it also does is it prints out the very concise usage instructions for the command line version. And there is a lot of stuff here, but if you look at the essentials, this is the application I'm running, so pdfToolbox. And then what it tells me is that in its most basic form, it's expecting a profile and then one or more input files. So the easiest command line that I can do is pdfToolbox followed by a profile followed by a one or more PDF documents or any other format of documents that pdfToolbox supports, and those will then be processed. Now, where does this profile come from? Well, that goes back to the reason that I download pdfToolbox server. What I need is also this desktop application. And when you run the desktop application, I can go to tools and profiles. And of course, these profiles that are talked about there are the profiles that are mentioned uh, or collected here in this profiles window. So if I want to have a profile that I can use with the command line version, what I will need to do, and what you will typically do when you do integrations into a website and so on as well, is you will prepare the profiles that you need in pdfToolbox desktop. And then once that profile has been tested and does exactly what you want it to do, you will export that profile, and I can then save it, for example, somewhere on my desktop. And let me call this webinar. There can actually be spaces in there. That's not a problem. I just am going to give it a shorter name because that's easier if I want to show you here what is going on. So let me put that profile in our files folder here. And what I can try to do first of all now is I can run pdfToolbox. And as I said, we need a profile and we need a PDF document. So I can enter the profile. I could also on the Mac simply drag it on here, but because I'm actually in this files folder, the easiest thing is to just refer to it by name. And then I'm also going to use a PDF document. And if I run this now, what you can see is that now we get a totally different result. Instead of telling us that we don't know what we're doing, pdfToolbox has now run this profile that we exported on the PDF file that we gave it. And you see a whole bunch of progress information. Now, this progress information can be hidden. There are a lot of command line parameters that you can use to modify the behavior of pdfToolbox. And I will show that I think that is no progress. So if I enter that command line parameter and I run it again, you can see that the progress information is now completely gone from what pdfToolbox prints out. So on top of the default command line that I can have, which is a profile and one or more PDF documents that need to be processed, I can then start adding these command line parameters to modify the behavior of the pdfToolbox run. But in essence, it is still doing the same thing. It tells me that it is using a profile called webinar.kfbx. It is going to run that on an input file called empty.pdf, and then it tells me what it is doing to that document. And in this case, you see a number of lines starting with fix. That means that a fix-up has been executed on the document, and each time it will tell you what that particular fix-up is. So here it converts a color, it removes RBox from the document, it is optimizing the document, but I will also have lines that contain something else as the first word, and that is hit. And that hit line tells me that I have an error and that the error is the number of pages is more than one. So this particular profile requires that the number of pages in the document that we're checking is one. And because that is not the case, pdfToolbox already told us here we have 10 pages. Because that is not the case, it gives me an error. And at the end, I get a little summary. So 785 objects were fixed in this particular case. There was one error that was found. The output file is written to this document here, and then it says we're done, and has taken in total 2 seconds, which is probably a roundup of something that is a little bit less than that. Why does the output file end up here? Well, we haven't used any command line parameter to tell pdfToolbox what to do with the output file. And because we haven't done that, it has simply written it to the same folder where the input file was. And because it doesn't want to overwrite the input file, which is called empty, it has called that empty, and it has added a suffix at the end of the file name. And each time I run this command, and I've already run it twice here, once with the progress information, once without the progress information, each time it will increment the suffix that it adds to the end of the file. So my input document has not been changed, but pdfToolbox has created the output document that I requested. And because there were fix-ups, this output document is going to be different than the input document. So this is the most basic way you can use the command line version of pdfToolbox. But of course, in this way, it would not be very useful when you start integrating it into a third-party application or into a website, because we would like to have a little bit more control. So remember what I did in the beginning here. We had this command without anything else, and then it gave me all of this additional information on what it expects. And you can see all of the command line parameters that I could use in this case. And if I would look over all the lines, I would encounter this no progress probably at some point as well that I used. But of course, this is, well, very, very concise information. So what if I want to know what this no progress parameter actually does? Or what if I want to know what the options are for some of these parameters? At this point, I can do two things, and which one you prefer to do is, well, it depends a little bit on who you are and what your preference is, but I can either go look at the documentation, or I can skip the documentation and use the documentation that is built into pdfToolbox CLI itself. And I'll do what people will tell you you have to do first, which is going to the documentation. So if you go to the Callas software website, well, there is a section there with products. And if I go to pdfToolbox, then you see these 4 versions of pdfToolbox that I was talking about. And then you have this thing here. So this is where you can download it from and where you find some of the other information, including release notes and features and so on and so on. Instead, I can go to support and to online documentation. And if I click that, I go to a site that you can also reach by simply typing help.callassoftware.com. And there is a German version of this as well. And the German version can be reached under hilfe.callassoftware.com, or you can go to the German version of the Callas website. So I can change this here to German. And when I then go to online documentation, of course, this will also be in German at this point. If I then go there, then I will end up on the German version of the online documentation. And there's all kinds of interesting information here, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the main pdfToolbox file. This is the documentation file for the complete pdfToolbox product. And as you can see on the right-hand side, there's a whole bunch of chapters in there. And actually, if we go to chapter 19, don't think it will always be 19. We still continue to add to the documentation, but there will be a chapter near the end of this pdfToolbox book that is about the command line. So I can go there, I can start reading about the installation and the activation, or I can look at all of the different topics that are described there. And amongst those topics, what you will see is command line options, additional command line options, response files. We will talk about response files a little bit in a second. And then using profiles and so on and so on. So all of the usage of pdfToolbox is explained in this online version of the documentation. You will also have an offline version. If you go to the document folder under the CLI folder, there will be a documentation file there as well. My advice would be to always use the one that is on the website because that should be the most up-to-date version of it. So if you feel so inclined, then you can go to the online documentation and read everything there. But once you start to get the hang of pdfToolbox, there is actually a much cooler way to get around. And what I can do is I can type pdfToolbox --help. Now, pdfToolbox has two types of command line options. Typically, there are options with one dash and then a letter like -h, or you can see a bunch of them here, -f, -w, -r, or you have long command line parameters that start with two dashes and then a fully spelled word. And for some reason in my brain, the long versions always stick, so I tend to use pdfToolbox --help. If I run that, I'll get a whole bunch of stuff. So let me scroll up to where we issued that command. This is where I said pdfToolbox help. Then you get the short information again, but then you get a list with command line parameters. And if I scroll far enough, you can see a second way to run the command line. We're going to look at both of them, but we're going to start by looking a little bit at those command line parameters that are useful when you run a profile with pdfToolbox. You have the list here, and while not all of them will always be as helpful, in many cases, you will find what you need to customize the way the integration will work in or using pdfToolbox in this list of command line parameters. And I'm going to show a single one here that is called language. Now, what can I do with that? Well, I can run the same command we did before and add a command line parameter. Most of the command line parameters that have a value, what you would do is you would type the name of the command line parameter, in this case language, you would add an equal sign, and then you give whatever value you want to pass using that command line parameter. And I could say ES. And what is different now is, of course, I'm still doing the same preflight because I'm using the same preflight profile. But this preflight profile supports multiple languages. It's one of the built-in preflight profiles that has been localized. So it supports multiple languages. And by saying language equals ES, I am actually saying to pdfToolbox that it should run the preflight, but every bit of reporting that is done should now be done using Spanish. So instead of convert color, I have convertir color. So by simply using this command line parameter, I have modified the way that pdfToolbox runs that particular profile on the input file that I am using. And that is the same for all of these command line parameters that you see here. So if you're looking at integrating pdfToolbox in a website, for example, it would be very helpful to go over these command line parameters and see which of those would come in useful in your situation. And I will point out just a few. I can't go into all of them because that would take too much time, but I will point out a few. The first one is that you have a command line parameter that is called -- output file. An output file allows you to specify where the output file is going to be created, and it allows you to specify the name of the output file. So if you don't want this automatic same name as the input file with a suffix added, then you can use this output file parameter to specify where the output file is going to be created and with what name. So that's one that is useful. We were talking about integrating in a website, and in that case, this cache folder command line parameter is also an important one. In most cases, when you look at a website integration or a portal, a web to print shop integration, the process that runs pdfToolbox command line is a very limited process. That means that it cannot write just anywhere on the disk because it will not have write um, access to most of the disk, which is very smart from a security point of view. Cache folder allows you to tell pdfToolbox where it can write, so which folder you have made available for that process, and pdfToolbox will then write all of its temporary information and all of the files that it needs for caching, for example, for font information. It will write all of that stuff into the cache folder. And that has two advantages. One, you can specify the folder where that is, so you only need to give this process write access to this cache folder in that case. And the second advantage is that everything is neatly kept together in this folder. And for your web portal process, for example, it's much easier to clean up temporary information in the background as well and keep control over where pdfToolbox will write stuff on your disk. So that's kind of an important one as well. There's a whole bunch of others that could be important, but let me move on a little bit to the most important one maybe, and that is this report parameter. And as you can see, it is a relatively long one with all kinds of different options. And the purpose of report is to create a pre-flight report from the pre-flight that you have been doing. Yeah? So if I go back to my command line that we had before, this profile that we're running on the empty.pdf input file that we have, well, if I want to know in more detail what the result of the pre-flight is, or I want to have something that I can share with a customer, then I need to generate a report. And very often what you'll see in those kinds of integrated environments is that there is a huge benefit in being able to generate an XML report because my web to print shop or web portal can take that XML file and display it back to the user. So let's see if we can get that done. So what I need is this parameter that is called report. And well, we return here. We have all these options. So we could start by saying, well, I know I want an XML report. And then pdfToolbox also allows me to say when that report is going to be generated. And then I have a bunch of additional options that I can use. And I can also decide where the report is going to be written. Yeah. So if I try to do something that works here, so I'm going to say XML. These options are separated with a comma in this case. So I could say I always wanted. And if we're adventurous, I could say the path needs to be report.xml. Let's see whether we got that correct. We're back to using English, of course, because I've removed the language parameter. And what you can see at the end of the command now is that I have this um, output file that is being written. pdfToolbox tells me that it finished with the input file that it picked up. And then it also tells me that a report file was now written. And when we look at the folder, there is now indeed a XML file that was created in this folder, and this XML file contains all of the pre-flight information as well, including which errors we received, and then all of the information from the profile that would let me help um, display these errors to the user in an integration scenario. In most cases, the command line of pdfToolbox is very, very flexible, which means that I can, for example, for reports, I could decide to comments. I could decide to generate multiple reports at the same time, maybe generate them using different languages. I could have one English report and one French report or one Spanish report. All of those things are possible. So I can keep adding command line parameters to my command line to get exactly the result that I want. And this could, in the end, lead to a problem. And the problem is that my command line is going to get extremely long. And sometimes, well, that could actually cause a problem. But there is a solution for that. And let me show you what the solution is. And to do so, I'm going to use a different profile that I prepared ahead of time. The profile is called check trim size. And that check trim size profile uses variables. If you don't know in the context of pdfToolbox what variables are or what you can do with them, please go have a look at these webinar recordings on our site. There are a number of webinars that talk about variables. It's a really, really cool concept. So how do I know that there are variables in here? Well, if you would run this help command again, you would see that there is a command. Actually, I have it on top here. There is a command that I can run, and I need to tell you a little bit more about this facility to also run commands and not just profiles. But let me go in a little bit of detail first here. There is a command that I can run that is called list variables. And if I specify a profile to that, it will give me a list of all of the user configurable variables in that profile. So in this profile that I checked, I have one variable that is called var underscore trimbox underscore height and another one trimbox width. And they both have a default value and they both have a description. The description is typically what is used and shown to you in pdfToolbox Desktop when you would run this profile. And pdfToolbox Desktop would ask you what are the actual values that you want to test with. The description is, of course, not used in the command line. What happens when I run this profile on the command line? Well, let me run that. So I'm going to take this profile and then I can take an input file, empty.pdf, yes. And when I run that, it tells me, first of all, the values of these two variables. Now, I have not done anything special. So the values that you see there are the default values that are embedded in the profile itself. Now, if you look closely, you'll see that there is also an additional line called variable. And actually, this is a variable called script trim box size, but this is a JavaScript variable. It's not a variable that is set from the outside of pdfToolbox, but it is a variable that is calculated in the profile using JavaScript. And what you see here is not the default value, but it's actually the value that was calculated by pdfToolbox in this case. We get an error, which is the intention in this case. And what it's saying is document is not 210 times 297, and then it tells me the actual size of the trim box. Yeah. So I can run this. I can run this profile. And when I run this profile, these variables are used. Now, I also, of course, have a possibility to set these variables. And when you're starting to think about how you can integrate pdfToolbox in a web-to-print environment, for example, now it becomes very interesting because if my web-to-print environment knows something about the job, for example, it knows what the trim size of this job should be, then I can use this information and pass it as a variable to pdfToolbox, and pdfToolbox can use that information inside of the profile that is running. How do I do that? Well, I use the setVariable command line parameter, and then I need the name of the variable. So I can say trimbox height and a colon and the value that I want to use instead. If I run that, you can see that right now it tells me the trim box height that we're using um, in this profile is now not the default value that we had before, which was 297, but it is 148, the value that I passed into pdfToolbox. And because that value or these two values are now the same as the actual size of the trim box, I am no longer getting an error as I did above. So by inputting this variable using this setVariable command line parameter, I've modified the behavior of that profile. Now you can imagine if you have lots and lots and lots of variables that you're going to end up with a very long command line, and maybe that's not exactly what I want. Now, there is a way to work around that, and the way to work around that is called response files, and I have prepared one here. And let me see if we can open this using something that makes sense. Response files are simple text files in the end, so all you need is a decent text editor. And if you look at the response file, it is actually very simple. Each line that starts with a pound sign is a comment and is ignored. Each line that is empty is also ignored. And then I can add command line parameters. In this case, I am specifying the profile. I am using the overwrite command line parameter. That's one that says instead of using or adding a suffix to the end of the file name, I simply want you to overwrite whatever file is already there with the same name. And you can see that I also have these setVariable commands in there. And now instead of creating a very complicated command line, what I can do is I can add an @ sign. I can add the variables, well, not just the variables, all the command line parameters in this response file. And then I can add the file that we want to process. And even though we have not specified a profile on the command line itself, and we have not specified anything else in terms of command line parameters, what we have now is, well, the variables have been changed. So the information that I put in this response file was used to modify the behavior. Basically, every line in this response file is interpreted by pdfToolbox and is assumed to be a command line parameter and simply executed. So using a response file can help to keep your command line that you're running much shorter and to have all of the information in the response file itself. And you can have multiple response files on the same command line. That's not a problem. So you could, even in the case of an integration, this is very often very useful when you're testing things, but even in the case of an actual integration in a production environment, you could work with these response files to specify different sets of command line parameters and kind of gather them in a way that makes sense to you in that environment. Yeah. And I can see that I had a remark about command line length at some point from Yuyan, but these response files in this way can be a way to overcome the length of what you can type on a command line. That limit used to be much shorter in the past, so it was much more of an issue. Right now, you can go very far. I've seen people doing integrations in Linux that have command lines that would not fit on my screen. But if you don't want to do that, then look at these response files. And as you perhaps already saw when I showed you the documentation, they are actually completely documented on the website. Now, um, I've done something that, of course, is very bad from an educational point of view. I've used a command before I actually told you what commands are. So let me go back to this help, and here is this list with command line parameters that we've been looking at and using. But if I scroll down, you can see this second section, and that simply says pdfToolbox dash dash command, and then you have a list of commands. Well, these commands are things that typically cannot be done, not in all cases, but in most cases, things that cannot be done in a profile, but that the command line version, the CLI, allows you to do natively using a command. And I will give you a very simple example. There is a command here that is called save as image. If you wonder what that does, well, it corresponds to what I have in pdfToolbox desktop. I could go to switchboard and then to documents, and under document to image export. And under image export, I see that I can export either a JPEG or a TIFF or a PNG or a rasterized PDF. I cannot easily build this into a profile. I could in some way build this into a process plan, but in the CLI, I have the option of running that save as image command directly. So what I can do is say save as image, and then I'm going to specify a file, and I'm going to say OK, and what I get is a JPEG file. Yeah. Now, this is, of course, very cool. It's a direct action on a PDF document, but, well, either I will have to go look at the documentation again, or I have to find a way to figure out what the options are for the save as image. Because in pdfToolbox desktop, I showed you that you could save a TIFF or a JPEG or a PNG, so there must be options. Well, luckily what callas has done is in this help command, I can add the command that I'm interested in. So I can say dash dash help, a space, and then simply the command that is in this list that I want to use. And if I run that, I get the command line for that specific command. So pdfToolbox save as image. It tells me that it expects an input file, but it also shows me all the command line options that I can use specifically with the save as image command. And it gives me explanations as to what they do. And so if I want a PNG file and not a JPEG, it will tell me, for example, to use this image format command. And each time it tells me the default here is JPEG, so that's what I get when I don't do anything special. So if I want to have a PNG instead of the JPEG file that we get, I can say, I should have remembered what it was called. I hope it's this, image format equals PNG. So the general format is still the same. You have, it's a long parameter, so you have two dashes in front of it. Then I have the name of the command line parameter, an equal sign, and a value that I want to pass. And if I remembered the command line parameter correctly, here we go. And now I have a PNG file. And like this, I can look at all of these command line parameters because for save as image, for example, I can specify the color space, I can specify what resolution I want to export, what compression I want to use, and so on and so on and so on. So there's really a very long list of command line parameters that you can use with pdfToolbox in this way, using the save as image command. Now, if it's not save as image that I'm running, of course, I can simply modify the command I'm interested in. What I used before was list variables, and if I run help on that, well, here you see that my options are very limited. And basically, I have no options. The only thing I can do is list variables and the profile. These other things, well, you have the administrative stuff like setting the cache folder, or if you're using a dispatcher and so on, how that will work, where they are, and so on. But basically, in this case, the only thing I can do is list variables and it will spit out the variables for that profile. So the options that you get are very, very different from one action to the other. But in general, the syntax is the same. I have the PDF toolbox executable. I have the um, command that I want to use and the PDF file I want to use it on, and a list of all of the command line parameters that I want to use with that particular command. And of course, you have to be a little bit careful that those command line parameters are actually valid, because if they're not, then PDF Toolbox will tell you that, again, you don't know what you're doing. And that's another thing. The CLI for PDF Toolbox does a lot of error checking, and that means that if you have an incorrect command somewhere, and it's very simple to have incorrect commands sometimes. For example, if you have a PDF file where you have spaces in it, you have to take care to either escape the spaces or to put a delimiter around the spaces, so you can do something like this as well and put it inside of quotes. If you don't do that, then it's very well possible that PDF Toolbox will look at parts of your file name and will assume that you're trying either to give it multiple files or that you're trying to pass it command line parameters, and then it will give an error. In most cases, the error is actually a very good indication of what is going wrong, except that it can be a little bit cryptic, but that's always the case with command line in this case, of course. Um, it does a lot of error checking, but not just on the command line parameters that you're using. Also, when there is a problem with the file cannot be found, or it cannot be read, or an output file cannot be written, or the input file is corrupt, or it's not a PDF document. All of these cases are normally caught by the command line version as well. And instead of simply crashing and letting you try to figure out what went wrong, there will be an error code that is generated. That list of error codes, that is also something that is interesting. So you have this help command that is interesting, but there is also something that is called status. And status does two things. First of all, it shows you the um, licensing information for PDF Toolbox CLI. So it tells me that this copy is limited to, well, it's actually assigned to me. It's licensed to me. It has an expiration date. I have no idea why I generated that, but anyway, it has an expiration date very far in the future. Um, so it shows you the current license information. This is not the license key, by the way. It's an activation code. So for those of you who are actively noting this down, this will only work on my system. And then it shows you these return codes, and the return codes are what is, well, what the command line version returns when you call it. So typically for command line applications, there is, from the scripting language that you're using, there is some kind of process or exec or whatever the name is, but there is a command that you use to run this PDF Toolbox CLI, and PDF Toolbox CLI will return a number, and the number determines what the outcome was. If you're running a profile, for example, and PDF Toolbox returns a 0, it means that there is no hit and no fix-ups. No hits means no errors or warnings, And no fix-up means, well, no fix-ups were executed on this particular file. And so depending on the number, you have numbers from 0 to 8. Uh, 4 is missing if you notice here. Numbers from 0 to 8, those numbers will immediately tell you after a pre-flight what the situation is and whether any corrections were done on the file that was processed, and if there were errors or warnings or information items in that pre-flight that you did. If something went wrong during the call, then you will normally get a code that is an error code. For example, you have a number of errors here. You have a number of errors here as well. For example, it, you could get the result that the file, I have to keep doing that or stop doing that, that the file could not be saved. And that means that, well, you have a problem writing the file to wherever you specified that. There are also a number of codes that are linked to activation. For example, you had a trial, but that was expired, or you have a time-limited key code as the one I have in here, and that one expired, or an invalid activation, which probably means that you have no license for this particular software, or something changed too much to the system. Any of these cases that where something goes wrong, you will get an error code that explains what went wrong as well. Okay, so if there are any other questions that you want to ask, now would be a very good time to ask them. Let me just recapitulate recap what we've done. And I don't think I made a summary in my PowerPoint this time, so I'll just show you the last slides with contact information on it as well. Let me just recap what we've done. We've looked at the command line, pdfToolbox CLI. CLI is typically the one that is used for integration either with other applications or on websites, web-to-print environments, and so on. That CLI can either be used in a terminal window or it can be used from within a scripting environment. And it can automate just about anything that you can automate with pdfToolbox desktop. And what we've talked about is that if I go back to this help command, that there are two basic ways to run it. The first one is running a profile, and then we went over some of the command line options for that. And then the second one is that you can also use commands. And these commands can do things like saving preview images out of the PDF file that you pass it, or it could split and merge PDF files, or it can do imposition. All of these things that are hard to do inside of a profile, but are typically very useful in an environment where you integrate pdfToolbox into a web portal or something like that. I think that's about what I wanted to share, and I don't see any options. There is one remark, thank you, Jan, that there is a trace command. This is actually something that is relatively new. It was added in pdfToolbox 10 officially. The trace command can be used for debugging purposes. So if you ever want to figure out what's going on under the hood when you use the CLI to run a profile on a PDF document, for example, then you can use this trace command. And the way you use it is that you set a path for logging files. And those logging files, there's some of them, and you can see the names here. And those logging files are JSON files, so JavaScript files, if you want, JavaScript variable files. And in those JSON files, you'll find information on what exactly pdfToolbox did while it was launching the application, an init and a finish of the application. There's a whole bunch of information in there. So if at some point you run into a problem where you want to have a better understanding of how long something takes or what the different steps are that are going on internally in pdfToolbox, then using this trace command line parameter might be a smart idea as well. Before we stop this, let me point you very briefly again to the help pages. So like I said, help.callassoftware.com gets you there directly, but you can also get there from our website. But that gets you to the online documentation, and it contains a lot of information for the CLI, also on a number of topics that I really didn't have the time to go into. For example, you can run the CLI in such a way that it will process hot folders, which means that pdfToolbox server, the hot folder based processing tool, can actually be used on a Linux box, for example, as well. We also haven't talked about distributed processing, where you will use a dispatcher and satellites so that if you have a high volume of files, that those files can be distributed across multiple machines. Um, there is information about a SOAP interface that exists. There is some information about custom reports. So there's a lot of information in this section that goes in a lot more detail than what I've been able to cover here. If any of that um, still raises questions, then well, you see my email address here at the bottom. You can also, and if you have a specific technical question, it's much better to use the support email address. That's support@callassoftware.com or support@4ps.com. Both work, and they will both end in the same bug tracking system, or support tracking system rather. It's not all bugs, luckily. So if you have questions, feel free to send an email to support. They will take a look at what doesn't work with pdfToolbox CLI, or what questions are remaining. If there is something very specific that you want to bring up, then you also have my email address at the bottom if you want to do that. If there is something that you would like to see covered in one of these webinars, don't hesitate to do that as well. We have lots of topics, and at the moment, I think we have planned support webinar series up until somewhere end of October or end of November, but we're always looking at interesting topics to add to the list. So if there is something that you think would be a good topic for this, and where you could use some more explanation on how to do something, don't hesitate. Just fire off an email either to support or to me, and we will put it on our list. There was one last question I will try to answer, although I think the answer will be short and very negative. And that is, how can we change the default cache folder? Unfortunately, you cannot change that. So we talked about that cache folder with the here cache folder command line parameter. The only way to change the cache folder is, in fact, to have that line on the command line. So there is no way to change what pdfToolbox uses by default out of the box. If you want a different location, you will need to pass the cache folder on each command line call. Like I said, of course, you could use a response file to contain those parameters that always remain the same, but you will always have to pass it. There is no way to change the default. Okay, I think that was it for me. I'm always surprised that for these technical topics, everyone seems to stay until the last minute, so thank you for that. I hope this was interesting and useful. Like I said, if you have follow-up questions, don't hesitate, send them to support, or send a question to me, and I will make sure it ends up in the right place. Thank you very much for joining. Have a great day wherever you are, and I am sure I will see many of you again for an upcoming webinar.